So now we'll have the next hour to reflect about risks children face in all phases of a mega sporting event. So we're going to get into now what we hope will be very practical, very grounded, we hope helpful uh, a session to help understand how kids are at risk when your city is hosting a mega sporting event. So I'd like to welcome Andrea Florence, Child Athlete Wellbeing and Protection Officer at World Players, Dorothy Rozga, Head of Child Rights at the Center, so on my team, Danielle Goldberg, Director, Advocacy and Engagement at UNICEF USA, and Lucy Amos, Child Rights and Sports Specialist at UNICEF UK. So Andrea Florence, let's start with you. Take us through some of the risks that kids face during a mega sporting event.
Hi, Mary. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I would like to start with the video.
Eu brincava quase todo dia na rua e tinha muita gente aqui. E agora não tem ninguém. Quando as casas começaram a ser demolidas, foi muito assim, ruim. O trator, quando ele passa na rua, muitas vezes ele vai deixando uns buracos, fazendo buraco. Aí quando choveu, encheu d'água. Aí quando eu passei de bicicleta, eu caí ali de bicicleta no buraco. Os peões de obras, eu não podia sair muito, porque eles tinha muito homem aqui, então minha mãe não deixava eu sair sozinha. E aí ficava meio difícil também para ir brincar. Eu falaria para o Comitê Olímpico que as Olimpíadas não é uma coisa boa para os pobres e para a população, porque desabriga muitas pessoas e não é bom para a vida de ninguém, para criança, adulto, só para os esportistas mesmo.
Thank you, Thais. So my name is Andrea Florence, and I'm a Brazilian human rights lawyer and child rights specialist. I followed closely the impact that the 2014 Brazil World Cup and the 2016 Rio Olympics had on children. Today, I want to share with you what I witnessed unfold before and during the 2016 Olympics. I went to Rio to understand how the Olympics were impacting children and their communities. This research is gathered in a report entitled Breaking Records, available at the center's website. Apart from reviewing newspapers, articles, academic studies, and official state data, I've also conducted in-person interviews with children and their families, with lawyers, public defenders, police officers, and also members of other local non-governmental organizations. The names of some of the children were anonymized for their safety, and the children were also able to stop the interviews at all times if they felt uncomfortable. A local child rights NGO also provided support to all of the children and families interviewed in the 6 months that followed the report. While the message of a new world was the official slogan of the Rio 2016 Olympics, it was one of optimism. The Games would be a showcase for new heroes and for the transformative power of sport in new territories and for the next generation. As medals were awarded, the prospects of the Olympics leaving a brighter future for young people in Rio began to look more and more unlikely. So you've just listened to Pérola. She was 12 years old when the Olympics took place. Pérola is from Vila Autódromo, the community neighbor to the Olympic Park. Vila Autódromo was once home to more than 600 families. And although they had long lived under the threat of eviction, as the Games began to approach, government pressure intensified. Energy cuts, lack of clean water, debris left lying around, and police violence during forced removals. Families were left in a precarious situation, homeless, or have been moved to government housing as far as 60 kilometers away from their original homes, some of it which were dominated by militia gangs. After several years of protests, in April 2016, at the eve of the games, the government authorities at last agreed to rehouse 20 out of the 600 families within Vila Autódromo. Pérola is part of one of those 20 families that was able to stay. But at what cost? Due to the high influx of men coming to construct the stadiums, girls were afraid to leave their homes. Oppressive tactics and indiscriminate use of force to remove families from their homes caused long-term psychological consequences. And children that faced forced evictions have missed out on school places, have been moved to dangerous areas, and lost contact with friends and the social fabric of their previous communities. In Rio alone, more than 22,000 families have been removed from the year Brazil was awarded the Games in 2009 to 2016, according to official statistics. This was the biggest wave of removals Rio has ever seen. I would like to talk now about another impact that the mega sporting event had on children in Brazil, the so-called street cleaning operations. In the run-up and during the 2014 World Cup, municipal guards, together with inspection and sanitation institutions, would go through some of the city's districts, generally in tourist areas, collecting not only garbage and illegal merchandising, but also people and children living in the streets. In fact, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child warned the Brazilian government of a repeat situation in the Olympics. No change in practice took place. So-called street cleaning operations and compulsory collection of adolescents in street situation were common right before and during the Rio Games. Elena was 17 years old when I met her. She was living in the streets of Rio when the games were taking place. She reported that while she sat on the streets with other youth, a white van approached and obliged them to go to the shelters. They also reported having been beaten up by municipal guards. A public-private partnership counting with more than 500 agents, both from the military and the civil police, took place in areas closely connected with the venues built for the Olympics. According to official statistics, by the end of the Games, the operation saw more than 2,000 arrests, out of which more than 600 were people living in the streets. The number of adolescents arbitrarily detained in juvenile detention centers also increased in the run-up to the Games. The third and last impact I'd like to point out relates to police killings and the indiscriminate use of force against protesters. Violence in Brazil disproportionately affects young Black men. Brazil has the second largest number of homicide victims among children and adolescents in the world. The possibility of a young Black man being murdered is almost 3 times higher than a white man, and male adolescents are roughly 12 times more at risk than girls. As the Olympic Games approached, police killings increased. The months of April, May, and June 2016 saw a 103% increase in the number of police killings in the city of Rio when compared to the same period in the previous year. Young people were particularly affected by the increase of police interventions as the Olympic Games approached. The security scheme for the Rio 2016 Summer Olympics was the biggest in the history of Brazil. It included 85,000 police staff around the city, double of what London saw in 2012. At least 8 people have been confirmed to have been killed by the police over the course of the 2 weeks of the Rio Games. 2 of them were under 18. According to a collective mapping app, Crossfire app, 92 shootouts took place in Rio de Janeiro during the Olympics. Our interviews revealed an aggressive approach by the police with indiscriminate use of force towards adolescents who decided to protest right before and during the 2016 Games. Many protesters were actually arrested under the Football Supporter Statute, a law that was passed specifically for the mega sporting events, which constituted a crime to disturb the order in the array of 5 kilometers in the surrounding area of a sports facility. So what did these impacts have in common? They were all preventable. eviction, street cleaning operations, and police violence should not be part of the records of a mega sporting event. These risks, of course, were particular to the city of Rio and Brazil. Some of you will face the same issues, but others will face different risks. And as part of the recommendations for future city organizers and mega sporting events, I would like to highlight 4 points. First, it takes courageous and robust due diligence process, which includes risk and impacts assessment and a wide range of stakeholder consultation and engagement. For each city, this will be different, and it takes courage to look at what is not working. And being part of this workshop is already really important, so I would like to congratulate you all for being here. Second, based on the risk assessment, it's important that cities develop a targeted and human rights-based mitigation plan. Third, as events managers should track, all events managers should track and monitor all stages of the events in collaboration with independent monitoring organizations to oversee the implementation and commitment and actions planned and provide resources and channels for reporting. And lastly, all contracts and commercial partners must stipulate that they need to respect human rights throughout their supply chains. And in case they do not comply, sanctions should apply. In the event of a human or child rights violations, people should also have access to effective remedy and grievance mechanisms. Major sporting events mobilize the entire society. Families and children are happy and excited about having them. We should channel all this energy and resources involved, not only to make sure that facilities and venues are ready, but also to look at how this event might impact the communities and how it could actually be used to make progress in terms of human rights and equality. Thank you very much, Mary.
Terrific. Andrea, I'd like to just ask you a question real quick. Couple questions. We talk about courageous and robust due diligence. You know, that's a human rights term that we like to use. It essentially means, you know, understanding what risks are possible, right?
Exactly. So the risk, for instance, I mentioned were risks that existed and that were exacerbated because of those mega sporting events. So it's looking at what is not working. That's why we're saying the word courageous. And it's also looking at what could happen because of the mega sporting event.
Right. So due diligence is, and this is part of, you know, sort of core human rights work, is what are the risks that you have to kids in general? So if that had been done, it would have uncovered these sorts of risks of displacement for sure. And one of the ways, and I had to do this myself for the bid process for United 2026, is I didn't know what those risks were because of my background and my experience. I didn't know what risks were for people trying to enter through the land border between Mexico and the United States if you look a certain way or your passport's a certain color. So I had to ask people. So that's why asking stakeholders who are very familiar with these risks and issues is really critical to doing really effective due diligence. And if you do that really good risk assessment and stakeholder engagement, you'll start to understand how you can prevent and mitigate, so lessen the impact of these bad things from happening. And then once you do that, you need to have a system in place to track and monitor what's happening. So after you do an initial risk assessment, what's in place to let you know whether or not things are working? And the most important part, Andrea, and you always, and I always talk about this, you know, it's important that, and when we talk about remedy, it means if someone's harmed, if something bad happens, how do you make it right? What's the mechanism to make it right? Is it an apology? Is it financial restitution, which in the case of forced displacement would probably be appropriate, and other measures. So, you know, these are just sort of some human rights terms that I just wanted to unpack for a minute. Grievance mechanism, when you hear that term, I didn't know what it meant. It means just how do you complain? How do you report and say, hey, this isn't okay. This is affecting my kids or something like this, right? This is, you know, what some of those terms mean. So with that, let's move on. And I'd like to bring Dorothy Rosga, our head of child rights, into the conversation. Dorothy, would you like to take us through a little bit of what we're talking about when we talk about human rights?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I come to you from Michigan and I'm snowbound today. As we have already said, and as you know, the 2026 FIFA World Cup is the first mega sporting event to include extensive human rights elements in its bidding requirements and processes. It obliges bidding countries to document human rights risks, as Mary had said, and propose strategies to prevent or mitigate them. Thus, we assume that you have all familiarized yourselves to some extent with human rights terminology and concepts. Nevertheless, we thought it would be useful to briefly cover these so that we are all on the same page in our understanding. In short, human rights are rights inherent to all humans. They are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. In modern times, these rights are enshrined in what is known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is an international document. It was adopted in 1948 by the UN General Assembly in the aftermath of World War II. The declaration itself is not a legal document. However, the standard of rights in the declaration has become the basis for international and regional treaties that have been ratified by countries and are legally binding. These treaties are sometimes called conventions or covenants. When a country ratifies one of these treaties, it becomes what is known as a state party to the covenant or the convention. So for example, Canada, Mexico, and the USA have all ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they are all state parties to this covenant and agree to abide by its provisions. They are obligated and legally accountable to what is outlined in the articles of the covenant. Now, human rights have certain characteristics, and I'm just going to highlight four that are very important. So first, human rights are universal. All people everywhere in the world are entitled to them. By virtue of the inherent dignity of each person, all individuals are equal as human beings. And all human beings are entitled to their human rights without discrimination of any kind, such as for race or sex, ethnicity, age, language, religion, political affiliation, or other status. Secondly, human rights are inalienable. No one can take away someone's rights, and no one can give away their rights. Third, human rights are indivisible. Whether civil, political, economic, social, or cultural in nature, they are all inherent to the dignity of every human person. Consequently, they all have equal status as rights. There's no such thing as a small right and a big right, or one right that's more important than another. There is no hierarchy of human rights. And finally, human rights are interdependent and interrelated. The realization of one right often depends wholly or in part upon the realization of others. So for instance, the realization of the right to health may depend on the realization of the right to education or the right to information. In human rights terms, we talk about duty bearers and rights holders. So a duty bearer, those are the actors who have a particular obligation or responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and to abstain from human rights violations. States or governments at national, local, or municipal level are all duty bearers. They are primary duty bearers. This includes, by extension, those who work for government, like police officers, administrators, teachers, social workers, and I think you in the audience. The state maintains ultimate responsibility, but it may delegate some of its responsibility to others, such as to private companies or to civil society groups. Non-state actors can also be considered as duty bearers, and we will talk about this a bit later on. So that's duty bearers. Now, individuals and groups who benefit from human rights treaties are called rights holders. They need to have the capacity and the opportunity to claim their rights. In this consultation, we are focused on the rights of children. And yes, children are rights holders. So are their parents and caregivers. For example, parents are entitled for assistance from the state in educating or protecting their children. In the diagram that you see, we use an arc to convey the importance of a mutually supportive relationship between the duty bearer and the rights holder. Together, duty bearers and rights holders create a strong bond, an arc that helps to uplift the dignity and the rights of all people. So now let's move on to children. Children and young people have the same human rights as adults do. But additionally, they have specific rights. And this is because they have special needs. Children start life as totally dependent beings. Gradually, their capacities evolve and grow. And as Mary indicated earlier, the definition of a child is someone under 18 years of age. So during this period, from birth to age 18, humans have particular needs and are at vulnerable stages in their development. Therefore, they have some unique rights and are entitled to special protection. So there are many reasons to pay attention to children's rights, and I will just mention 4. And the first is that children are individuals. Children are neither possessions of parents or of the state, nor are they mere people in the making. They are human beings and they are subject to their own rights. Secondly, the actions of government at national, municipal, or local level impact children more strongly than any other group in society. Practically every area of government, policies, and actions, from water supply to public health to mega sports events, affects children to some degree. Third, changes in communities have a disproportionate and sometimes negative impact on children. So globalization, climate change, migration, shifting employment patterns, urban development, and yes, COVID. All of these changes have a very strong impact on children, and mega sports events bring change. And finally, the cost to communities of failing its children are huge. Children's experiences significantly influence their future development, and this determines their contribution or cost to their communities over the course of their lives. More than 30 years ago, a human rights treaty was adopted that specifically defines the rights of the child. Danielle Goldberg of UNICEF USA will now explain to us the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Thank you. Danielle?
Sure. Jump right in. Thank you, Dorothy. So hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Goldberg with UNICEF USA. I'm greeting you from literally across the Hudson River from Manhattan in Jersey City. So Dorothy described these duties or responsibilities for every child. And as she mentioned, they are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or you may hear us say CRC. These were agreed in some form or another by every single country, providing a critical legal and ethical framework for what every child needs. And ensuring that everyone on both sides of that arc understand children's rights, that's a core mandate of UNICEF, which is why I'm so happy to have this chance to speak with you all. So what is the CRC? First, I want to take us back to 1989. It was 31 years ago, as of this Friday, which is World Children's Day, so get ready to celebrate on Friday. 31 years ago, something incredible happened. It was against a backdrop of a changing world order that world leaders came together through the UN General Assembly, and they adopted the CRC, the first legal document recognizing and demanding accountability for the rights and freedom of children. This took 10 years of negotiation by governments, NGOs, experts around the world. So it really is a pretty big deal. The convention lays out these rights in what we call articles, 54 of them. 42 outline specific rights, and the rest explain how the convention works and the accountability around it. Additionally, then there's 3 optional protocols. These are additional optional agreements countries can sign on to, such as there's one on children in armed conflict, one on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And there's another more recent one where children can bring complaints directly against their government directly to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And this is an independent body of experts that monitor implementation of the CRC by state parties. So there's so many reasons why this convention is special, and we want more people to know about it and use it. It's the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. So it's been ratified by 196 countries. The only exception is the United States. Though I do think it's worth noting they did not only contribute to the development of it, but they also did ratify 2 of the optional protocols, the first 2 I mentioned. It's also the most comprehensive human rights treaty ever produced. So it covers all aspects of a child's life set out in civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights that every child is entitled to. But what's more important, we don't want to just talk about the legalistic aspect, is that the child rights are so much more than signing a treaty. It's a powerful framework, not just for governments, but for all duty bearers, for every organization, every individual working with and for children. It can inform our decisions, our behaviors, our programs, our activities, and help us to monitor and evaluate our impact on children. And now we really hope with this coming together, it's going to serve as a powerful guide for you, alongside those guiding questions that we have provided to help you in your planning for World Cup 2026. So what does it mean for real, for children, that at the end of the day? First, it's a big deal that world leaders recognize for the first time that children even have special rights, that they require special care and protection based on their age and their development. It also recognizes that childhood, which frankly, if we all were to ask what it means, may not have a shared definition. Childhood's separate from adulthood. Anyone under 18, this is a special time, a protected time where every child should be allowed to grow, to learn, to play, to develop and flourish, and with dignity. And another piece of this is that it was a revolutionary shift in how we see children. And once you get into it, it even starts to challenge some of our own preconceived notions or perhaps ageism. We're all guilty of it. It contains a profound idea that children, they're not just objects or pawns to be moved around, or belongings of parents for whom decisions are to be made, or just adults in training. And you often hear the next generation, but they are a generation of people right now who are capable social actors that they can influence the world around them. So that's another piece of it. And another point is that it shifts the mindset so that we are looking at child rights not just as something that's optional. Wouldn't it be nice if every child had access to quality education, healthcare, protection from violence? It's not a question anymore of favor or kindness to children or an expression of charity. It generates obligations and responsibilities that we must all honor and protect and respect. And it makes clear that a basic quality of life should be the right of every single child rather than a privilege enjoyed by a few. So I said 42 articles. That's quite a lot. I'm not going to go into them all here, but we encourage you to do your own study. I did want to pull out just a few. Once you start taking a look and you'll see them, I think as you more learn and go through the guiding questions, how they're reflected. There's so many that you will find are relevant to the planning of a major sporting event. Here just is a non-exhausted list of a few. These are laid out in what UNICEF has developed as in child-friendly terms. You're welcome for the lawyers out there to read the full treaty. But if you really want to understand, we encourage you you can take a look at this child or people-friendly version of the articles. And as Dorothy mentioned about human rights, every single one is interconnected. Every single one is equally important. So if you're taking a child rights approach to your planning, you can't just cherry pick a right. If you're going to take a child rights approach, you have to look at the whole child and see the interdependency of each. So if you take a look at some of the ones we pulled out, you can start to see some of these themes in what Andrea had laid out from the 2016 Rio Olympics. For example, we saw the video from Parola describing how her ability to play safely was affected with the potholes and the influx of men coming to construct the stadium. Her right to play safely, to leisure, to creative activities was impacted. We heard stories about children's right to a safe home were violated when they were evicted and sent to places where there is high militia activity. So then now again, their right to be protected from violence, abuse, education, all of those things were impacted. And then there's one thing I also want to mention is the right to participation, to be heard. That's such a critical one, and it's so great. We had someone like Andrea, a human rights lawyer, that came after the fact to ask how their lived experiences, the things that didn't make the news perhaps, but how much difference could we have made if from the beginning, every single vendor, every single decision maker took the time to engage young people as stakeholders, Helena and Parola and all the other children, to understand how their decisions were going to impact their lives. And then to fully embrace, as Andrea had said, these things could be prevented, but it requires all actors to fully embrace and operationalize their child rights duties throughout the life cycle. And that's what we're trying to get to here. So there's one more thing. 42 articles, all this legalistic talk is going to be, it's hard to put into practice, but you can pull out some overarching themes which can be useful in any decision you make. And so we're just pulling out 3, which you can find that are cross-cutting. And I want you, if you forget other things, to keep top of mind. And these are powerful tools to inform our decisions. So one of them is around every child having the right to be protected against all forms of discrimination. Doesn't matter their status, what they've done and gotten involved in, their opinions, the beliefs of their parents and caretakers. That's one. The other is that every child deserves to have their best interests taken into account as a primary consideration in all actions concerning them. And so many actions, if you think about it, do impact children, and disproportionately. Every child has a right to life, survival, development, and this is so key. And UNICEF, we like to say, it's not just about helping children to survive, but to help them to thrive, that they have quality of life to help them reach their unique potential. And then 4, that participation piece, that is to ensure that they're informed, that they can form their own opinions and be heard, And this is something in Child Friendly Cities we focus so much on, that if you're going to ask children what they think, you really should make sure you have a mechanism to sustainably take into account what they're saying, follow up, and put it into action. And I'm excited, later we'll get into that more. So this all makes what we call a child rights-based approach. And I hope we can socialize this the more we work together, and you'll see it embedded in the child-focused questions. So think about this. Ask yourself in any decisions that you're making throughout the MSC planning process, is this activity non-discriminatory? Is there anyone we're leaving out? Anyone falling through the cracks? Are we properly safeguarding every child? Is anyone going to be put in harm? Is it respecting their life and their development of every child? And are we engaging children as stakeholders? So as we move forward, we're going to have more opportunities to delve into that further. And I think what we'll see the results after the fact with World Cup 2026 is going to be dramatically different because we put this into practice. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand it over to Mary now.
Thanks, Danielle. That's pretty easy to remember checklist. And I also want to say, it's been mentioned by Dorothy, you will receive this PowerPoint presentation. So don't worry about whether or not you have to get everything down. You will receive it after the event. So that's an easy to remember checklist. But now I'd like to ask Lucy Amos from UNICEF UK to help us understand how to apply these concepts of child rights, right? Child rights, child voice. So now let's apply it to the context of a mega sporting event. So now very specifically, a deep dive into how this relates to something like the World Cup. Lucy, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And welcome everyone. It's great to have you here today. I'm coming to you from London, and the reason for that is that I've worked at UNICEF UK very closely with major sport event organisers, both in Gold Coast, Australia, but also in the Caribbean and other locations. So I come at this with a bit like some others in the group with direct experience of working with mega sport events. So the main thrust of what I want to talk through today is actually trying to introduce you to some of the frameworks. We've already looked at some of the international human rights frameworks with Dorothy and Danielle talking through particularly the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But you don't actually need to be an expert in human rights. There are plenty of other organizations out there, including the Centre, including UNICEF, that can help guide you. You don't need to be experts, but you do need to be thinking, as Mary said, through what some of your activities are and how they can impact people. And I'm going to talk you through some of the processes and context for that, and then look at the life cycle of a mega sporting event and have you work collectively with us through an exercise just to try and get you to be thinking more creatively and fully about some of the considerations that may come across your desk as you start to think about the risks and opportunities for these events. Just one second. So first thing really to say is to restate the obvious, which is that mega sports events like the World Cup involve an awful lot of stakeholders. They include obviously all the government actors that I know Dorothy was alluding to earlier, whether that's central government, municipal government, the police, teachers, social services, a whole range of actors. They include the organising committee, sports federations, in particular, national, the football associations of the three host nations, and also visiting teams. So in addition to them, there are of course all the people that can be impacted by the event, and that obviously includes children, but it includes the players, it includes the fans, the volunteers, the communities, and activists as well. They have a right to air their opinions, and they may not always agree with the event that's being hosted. So there's this great mix of people, and they all have a role in this mix. And in particular, the organisers have a responsibility to make sure that they are taking their part in making sure that they're not negatively impacting adults or children's rights, but are instead actually trying to find ways to find opportunities to help support people in the way they stage these events. Now, I'm not going to get into very much detail about this at all. This is but I'm referencing here an international standard called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And the reason for doing that is really because it is the standard that is increasingly being used in a sports context, specifically for major sports events. And it is the standard that is guiding a great deal of both FIFA's interaction on human rights, but also that of many of the major FIFA sponsors. So for example, Coca-Cola, Adidas, or Visa. And the reason it's relevant, it was agreed by governments in 2011 and is increasingly part of many international standards that businesses and governments are using. But it's particularly relevant to something like a mega sporting event like the World Cup, because it applies to governments. They have duties to respect adults and children's rights, as Dorothy alluded to earlier, but it also applies to all of the businesses that are involved in a major sport event. It includes the organizing committee itself, particularly if it's operating in any commercial sense. It includes all of the sponsors, the licensees, the broadcasters. So many actors involved in a major sporting event actually have a human rights responsibility. So this standard is relevant to them too. But as Mary so clearly pointed out as well, there needs to be a system in place if things go wrong. And that is about remedy. That's making things right when people get harmed. And it's inevitable that, life isn't perfect and mistakes can happen. So you can find out more about UN Guiding Principles if you're interested, but the real reason it's relevant, next slide, please.
Sorry, Lucy. I think Mary just wanted to jump in and make a comment.
Yeah, just real quick, go back to the UN Guiding Principles. One of the things that when I was learning about this that I found incredibly helpful was, how do you know when something happens if it's your responsibility? So something happens in a city, right? Or, there's some issue. How do you know what you have an obligation to do something about or not? And the UN Guiding Principles get very specific about that. And they say, this is what your responsibility is. This is what's yours. This is what's not yours, but you're obligated to, try to use leverage to solve. And this is what's not yours. And so if you also look at it as a framework through which you can apply that lens, it's hugely helpful in terms of helping you manage human rights risks. So that was the only point I wanted to help make, Lucy. Please continue.
No problem. Thanks, Mary. So again, as Mary says, it's a really useful framework. And one of the things that it does, particularly, as I say, for both governments when they're operating in a commercial way, but also for all of the businesses that are involved in a World Cup, is that it includes a process. It's a process that you can read about more later, but some of the key aspects of it are about identifying and addressing the risks, as we've talked about. But actually underpinning it all is this concept of stakeholder engagement. And it is actually talking directly with people that may be affected by the events, positively or negatively, but actually using those conversations as a means of added intelligence, getting more insights on some of the possible risks to people from the event that you might not otherwise have access to. It also is a way of building trust with people that can be affected by the event, and that includes children. And so that's why in this slide we've included both the need to give children a voice in this process, and in the following conversations today and tomorrow we'll go into further detail on that. But there are also additional guidance. There's an additional guidance in the Children's Rights and Business Principles, which basically takes the broad concepts that are in the UN Guiding Principles and tries to translate those and condense those specifically and target those specifically around the needs of children. So these are two standards. You do not necessarily need to be an expert in them, but they can actually, as Mary says, they provide a roadmap for some of your thinking, and they can help you set priorities. again, as Mary and others, Dorothy and Danielle have said, there's not a hierarchy of human rights, but sometimes you do need to work out, well, actually, which risks are going to be most seriously impacted? Are there actually really grave human rights or child rights risks that you need to take really proactive decisions on? And also, are there large numbers of people being involved? So there's sometimes these guidance, both the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the Children's Rights and Business Principles, can be ways to help you set priorities and really pinpoint where the highest level of exposure to risk can be. So now I want to talk through a little bit the thinking around the mega sporting events life cycle. Now we've already looked a little bit in, sorry, forgive me, there's messages and distractions going on all the time as we go. Really to say that across the mega sporting event, there are all of these different stages. No mega sporting event is alike. They're all very different. They are in, as we've seen earlier today, Andrea was talking about the experience of the Olympics in Brazil. I've worked, as I say, in Gold Coast, Australia on the Commonwealth Games. Mary's got more direct experience in the process of the bid for United 26. But the work from the Centre, from UNICEF and others has really started to help try and develop a set of a kind of a roadmap, if you like, for your thinking around the identification of risks and opportunities for mega sporting events, and actually to help you start to unpack, well, what are the activities at each of these stages where you could potentially either include children more, that might be in consultations or planning, and also where there might be heightened risks of exposure of children to human rights abuses, or where there may just be general issues concerning children that you need to think through a bit more carefully. So what we're going to do a little exercise in a moment, going through these stages. Actually, Thijs, could you just go back to the previous slide momentarily? Thank you. So as I say, no mega sporting event is identical. Some come with a higher heavy footprint of consultation, construction than others. Some are using existing venues. But there are these stages. There's the vision, the concept and legacy initial planning. There's the bidding process, the planning, design, and some of that can include land acquisition for the event. There's income generation. Who are your partners? Who are your business partners? There's sustainable sourcing, and that can be everything from timber for construction and overlay through to sporting goods, t-shirts and other merchandise. Construction of event facilities, that can be temporary buildings, not just major stadiums. Delivery and operations of the event, we've heard a little bit already about security. The competition itself, how child athletes and players can be impacted, and legacy, and how actually some of these events can have a really positive, lasting impact for people. So we're now going to try and do a little bit of an exercise to try and get you thinking in a practical sense. This is a fictional exercise. It's you can draw examples from events outside of the United 26. But I think there will quite possibly be transferable learning from examples elsewhere in the world. There may be different communities that could be impacted, but nonetheless, there are still children in those communities near you. So first of all, what we'd like to do is talk about those first three stages of the life cycle in a cluster. So looking at the vision and concept of the event, looking at the planning and bidding and design of the events, and then looking at the income generation. And at for each of these stages, what I want you to do is to write in the chat box any ways in which you think you could include children more in any of those stages, any areas where you can see particular risks to children, and any issues that might arise for children. So if you want to put those into the chat box, you can do so anonymously if you like. And I will generate those for the group, and Thijs will put them on a sticky note and they will appear, so that this is something that you can all take away after the event. So yeah, over to you.
And if you're doing this anonymously, please send the message to Lucy, as I'm in another program here to capture your thoughts.
So to recap, that is any risks that you see, any ways to include children more, including opportunities, and any areas where you're not certain whether it's a risk or an opportunity, but where you could see there could be potential issues for children. And this is particularly around the initial phases, the initial phase of the event, the planning, the design, the land acquisition, the preparation, all sorts of preparation, and income generation. Anybody going to be brave?
Well, I'll get us started. Since I had to do this for the United Bid, I remember sitting in a war room doing this exact exercise. So some of the risks could be, for example, when originally fan zones were identified, right? And you had to do a scope for the bid of what would go where, right? In terms of where you're going to put the fan zone, where you're going to put different aspects of it, broadcast center, is how do any of those sites have impacts for kids? Like if it's a park, right? You're taking away a play space for kids if you're going to have your fan zone in a park or major area. So that's going to increase and infringe upon their play area, presumably. But that's just a few ideas to get us started. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but just to get us rolling.
So we have a few coming up in the chat group. So Thijs, type away when you're ready. We have some ideas around construction sites and forced removals of families and children. That's a really key one. It's been the case in a number of contexts. As Andrea alluded to earlier, there have been many instances where families and homeless people have been evicted from their homes without adequate consideration given to how that will impact children and their lives, particularly, for example, their access to their schools or hospitals or medical facilities. So we've got other ideas. We've got create social legacies for physical activity for youth. That would be particularly around the vision. There's more coming through as we go.
While we're typing them, one is that we identified in the bid process was evictions due to Airbnb activity, where somebody might get evicted if they don't have housing laws that would protect them. And those are kids that could be, part of those families that are evicted to make way to Airbnb their accommodation, which negatively contributes to homelessness.
There are some other
It's a form of forced eviction.
Some additional ideas coming through here, talking about, I think I didn't mention this one. So social legacies for increased physical activity for children. Other examples coming through are ways of partnering with teachers to provide opportunities for children to engage classrooms to identify risks and to get children involved in the process. There's some coming through around existing training sites, relocating existing activities. So yeah, that's an important one, is quite often where there are maybe community sport facilities. Sometimes those are applied and given over to some of the visiting teams, but that actually may have an impact on the children who had previously been using those facilities. There's an opportunity here for employing teens through local non-for-profit agencies to work at the stadiums and develop professional skills.
And Lucy, from after this one, and if you can repeat, we have to move to the next cluster. But say that this last one again, please.
One is opportunities to employ teenagers through local non-for-profit agencies to work at the stadiums and develop skills. So yeah, that examples there can both be employed work, but also volunteering. Okay, so we'll share these with you after the event. So there's quite a lot of collective learning coming through here. Now let's have a little. There are some examples that I'll come back to because people have mentioned them, and we're slightly going out of the sequence of the life cycle, but that's not a problem. Then looking at the sourcing process, sustainable sourcing, the procurement and supply chain for the event, and the construction phase. Let me see if there's anybody coming up with any particular ideas around this, where some of the risks might be, some of the ways of including children, some of the possible issues could be.
There you go, Lucy. Child labor in the supply chain. Offshore, but it's hard. Offshore, what's your responsibility? It's a risk. It's likely offshore, not something you can directly control. This is where procurement codes become incredibly important.
Any thoughts on construction as well? Construction for the event and where some of those risks might be for children?
Or refurbishment, as the case will be for United 2026. You're going to be retrofitting and doing some things.
But it can also be in relation to any infrastructure development as well. So those
Building hotels.
Yep. So risks of construction zones may impinge on child play spaces. Yep. Some of the other considerations are if you've particularly got some workers who are working far from home, are they able to get home and visit their families on a regular basis? Are they being paid regularly and on time? That's usually the case in many countries, but not all countries. And it can have very lasting negative impacts on the families of children left at home. We've got some ideas around the loss of green space. Yep. So wage theft is coming through. Ideas here too of contracting vendors for the event committee to have policies in place that prohibit the use of child labour. Yeah, and increasingly there are also examples of mega sporting events putting in place kind of human and child rights clauses into their procurement standards. And also delivering training to suppliers, particularly the maybe some of the master suppliers. And actually that can actually have quite a lasting impact, positive impact on businesses in the host city, because they can start to become suppliers of choice. So there are some, some positive examples there if they have really strong and robust both child labour and also child-friendly processes that really consider the impact on children. Thijs, do we want to move on to the next one?
Yes, please.
We're okay here for a bit.
No, the last one now.
Move on to the next phase. So we'll capture all of these examples for you, and we'll share those with you after the discussion. Then also, if we're looking at this next cluster, so the delivery and operations of the event, the competition itself, and the legacy. So delivery and operations, security would be a major consideration there. And I know Andrea talked earlier about the issue of street clearances of homeless people, detentions potentially of adolescents with possibly in particularly discriminatory detention at times. Just going back through any of the earlier feedback. And actually during the event itself, there can be road closures. So during the operation phase, there can be road closures that actually, again, have an impact on children's ability to get to schools, to get to medical facilities, for their parents to be able to get to work, which and can actually have childcare implications. There can be issues also, particularly during competition time, for example, for volunteers around safeguarding. But there have been cases of ball boys and ball girls being abused verbally, particularly. Quite often there's racial and homophobic chanting at some of these events. Just going through some of your other comments. On the positive side, there can be opportunities for engaging elementary classrooms to adopt a team and country and learn more about that country. So there can be as educational examples, and as well as learning about different countries, they can also be learning about child rights. That's an avenue. I know that I was working on the Bahamas Commonwealth Youth Games, and there was quite an extensive program working with both young athletes and with children in the host community to actually consider the human and social development opportunities and new ways of learning to really get them thinking about these things. There's some more examples coming through. So use of 311 for grievance mechanisms for this and other issues. So yeah, ways of making complaints, hotlines. Yeah, there could be increased levels of traffic that might lead to injury, particularly for host children or visiting children. And if we're thinking a little bit about some of the overarching issues across this life cycle, there, and I know this is something that's going to come up in further sessions over the course of the next few days. How can you actually involve children in decisions that affect them? Can they be involved in consultations, actually play a proactive role, so that you're not thinking of children as objects or as victims, but actually as people that actually have an interesting perspective and can actually start to help shape some of the legacy and concepts around the event. So I think maybe that's the exercise completed for the moment. I'm taking a cue that the visual has changed. But I hope that's given you a little bit of a flavour of some of the ways in which across the whole spectrum of the event, the different activities, the different aspects of the event from start to finish and even beyond can actually impact on children. But there also can be ways that you can really include children in these conversations, but also work with expert organisations. Sometimes many campaign groups, some legal firms will offer pro bono support. There's a lot of help out there to really kind of navigate what some of these risks are, but also to explore some of the opportunities and ways of working with children. So we'll definitely be sharing with you some of the reflections that you just made here, but also we'll share some other thinking that we've done previously. So one of the things I know that didn't necessarily come up on income generation, for example, was actually are some of the partners that you're working with, do any of them, whether that's licensees, whether that's sponsors, broadcasters, do any of them have maybe a negative record regarding child rights? Maybe some of them might have used child labour, some of the licensees. There might be issues around marketing of perhaps tobacco or alcohol that would have an impact on children. So there are a whole range of impacts on children, but we've started to get the ball rolling, and I look forward to seeing how the conversations go over the next 2 days and how you really sort of put meat on the bones of all of the examples that we've just been exploring. So thank you, and good luck for the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucy. So that was a really good overview, and I'll share with you that when we did for the bid, we did a similar process as what we just did. So we took each In this case, it wasn't each stage of the life cycle because we knew what stage we were in. We were in the bidding phase, but it was more about what are the different groups of people and the different activities that go on in putting on a World Cup, and what are the risks. And I had external stakeholders in a room, and they did this exact exercise, except they had physical big Post-it notes, and they went up on a massive wall and they put those risks in there, which is what we just did. And then afterwards we said, okay, so for these risks, how do you prevent them from happening? And to talk to people who were so intimately familiar, to these stakeholders who represent, in this case, children, could say, well, these are some of the best practice on how you would do that. So it's the stakeholder engagement, I can't emphasize enough, is so critical to coming up with community specific, terrific ideas on how you prevent and mitigate some of these risks. So I just want to put in a shameless plug for stakeholder engagement once again, because it actually is what fed the development of the human rights strategy for the 2026 World Cup. So before we go to break, I wanted to ask if there are any questions of any of our speakers. And again, if you want to ask a question anonymously, please send it to Tace Prado. And I'll pause for a minute to see if there are.
Nothing yet, Mary.
Okay. Well, what we can do is let's go ahead and go to break. But in doing so, if you have questions, you can give them to Tace, and we can perhaps at the beginning of the next session briefly address them. The next session is going to be terrific because we're going to hear from 3 experts who were involved at the city level for the London 2012 Olympic Games, and specifically around children and child rights. So we're very excited. So we will be back in 28 minutes right here, and we look forward to seeing you back. We are on break.